vice president and president, serving over 20 years on the board. He has also been on many other historical related boards, having served as president of the Delaware Humanities Forum and the Friends of the Delaware Archives. He continues to have many leadership roles in the community, including his current positions as commander of a VFW post and chapter president and state vice president of the Sons of the American Revolution. He also served 33 years in the Army, retiring in 2015 from the Army Reserve at the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. He is currently working as an IT manager for Exelon, the parent company of Delmarva Power. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to present our speaker, Larry Josefowski.
Thank you, Mary. I first want to thank the Friends of Old Dover for having me here virtually to give this talk. And I will note that I am proud of all the accomplishments. As you can tell, behind some of those things are mementos from that area. But I'm certainly much more of an amateur historian. I took a few history courses in college. I did some research papers in the military, where I would say the standard for grades was a bit different than many of you are used to. As an example, I was part of a group project on the Battle of Antietam, where the instructor made it very clear that the weight of our grade was going to be strongly influenced by the weight and length of our finished product. But what I do have, however, is an interest, appreciation, and dedication to history and preservation. A lot of the organizations I am and have been in revolve around that, especially the Friends of Old Dover, which is why I'm glad to see so many people zoomed in here today. But if there was a complaint that I would have, and this was through all the years with the Friends of Old Dover, is that while our capital city has lived through many periods of history, we tend to focus on only two of them. The late colonial period, with the Golden Fleece obviously having a starring role in our history, and the green, and the Victorian era, which gives us a chance to showcase the architecture of the area, and the topic of next month's lecture, I believe, with Will Parkhurst. However, there have always been other periods of our area and how the area acted that I thought would be as interesting. The Civil War, the Depression, World War I and World War II. And I think those areas tend to get addressed a lot less, but I don't think they're any less important to our city, county, and state's history. But I specifically started thinking of the pre-Dover history about 10 years ago. As I did my research, there were other parts of the story that I wanted to expand beyond the city limits of Dover, Kent County, and even beyond, to cast an even broader net to help paint a picture of the earliest times, often through looking at the explorers and leaders, and at least one charlatan of the area and time, and some of the backstory that I don't think has been told. In many cases, the names may sound familiar, but maybe we've skipped over some of these people and from our past, or we got them a brief mention that as we look back, we barely remember from our history classes. I say that, of course, knowing that looking at the number of people and some of the names of the people on the screen, that the scholars, the professors, the archaeologists, the professional historians, these names may be a little bit maybe more familiar to you. However, in my experience, I haven't heard about some of these people and their stories, and wanted to share a bit of my study. And I certainly will appreciate any comments or suggestions afterwards. And now, Dover before Dover. Now, we live in a time that the perspective of history is changing all the time. But one of the top areas that seem to be in great review is in our continent's prehistory, and especially when exactly humans first arrived. Now, if you happen to read the history of Kent County, which was published back in 1976, it tells a very fanciful tale of Native American prehistory. I'll talk more about that later, but today we generally accept that most of the ancestors of the Native Americans arrived here from Asia, traveling across the Bering Sea land bridge about 12 to 15,000 years ago. There is some evidence, perhaps, that there were some earlier groups, maybe other cousins on our family tree, who made it to the Americas from other areas. Again, study continues, but archaeologists are trying to piece together what appears to be some evidence of humans, maybe Neanderthals, maybe Denovians, here that were here 50, 60, or even one recent claim that there were humans on the North American continent 130,000 years ago. We'll get back to that and how it ties into Kent County history, Kent County and Dover history later, but I'm going to start about 1,000 years BCE. By that time in the area, we would have seen many things that we would recognize as part of the Native American culture. Agriculture was beginning to develop, and as they planted and harvested crops like squash and pumpkins and sunflowers, and simple greens like goosefoot. And we see a move from cooking by simple cooking methods where they would drop heated stones into wooden bowls or skin bags to starting to use soapstone bowls for cooking and the use of clay pipes. Now, moving up ahead a little bit, during the 1st century AD, the area was visited by traders from the Ohio River Valley called the Adena people, named after the site of one of their mounds they had built. Again, we'll talk about the Adena people a little bit later. They traded their stone tools, axes and hoes that they had made, which were higher quality, but they'd also developed some artwork, including some copper ornaments. Now they made spoons and beads from conch shells, which are in the Ohio River, but are somewhat rare, which are somewhat in short supply. So they would trade their high-end tools and their artwork for shells and exchange information about farming. So moving ahead to the contact period, the Lenni Lenape at this time were a peaceable, loosely organized tribe with 3 major clans: the turtle, the turkey, and the wolf. Now, at the contact period, there was, in addition to these 3 major clans, each of the clans had subclans, and they tended to stay in these subclans, except when they would get married, in which they would marry outside that. But their tools and weapons were stone, bone, and wood. They didn't have much metal to speak of, and they wore animal skins and made blankets out of fur and feathers and some fibers. And while some evidence of permanent villages have been found in Kent County, they tended to visit the area for hunting and fishing. At the time of the first explorers, the Lenni Lenape tribe was estimated to be about 10,000 members. But by the 1670s, war, famine, and disease probably cut that population to about half that number. They remained in small numbers in the area, with the last large group leaving the area about 1754, moving north and west. Now, if you read that 1976 history of Kent County, it talks about a much earlier settlers going back 60,000 years ago. And if you read it, they mention a carving of a mammoth on a shell, which is what I'm depicting on the background in the slide. And they also talk about it's in the Smithsonian, giving it an aura of respectability, perhaps. It's told in a very definitive style, and it would indicate that that this was evidence that there was people here many 60. I think they even have even longer than that. But it's probably based on a forgery, and it's a good opportunity to talk about our first person, Hilborn Crescent. Now, this is what's called the Holly Oak pendant, and it's a really interesting piece of history. It is a shell, as you can see here, with 2 holes in it, and it would be worn around the neck, and it has a mammoth painted on it. And it was purported to have been discovered by him in the 1860s in the peat along the Delaware River as they were building a railroad station in Hollyoak, Delaware. And it happened to coincide with other discoveries in Europe at the time of early man. But there were a few problems with the story. The first is the shell would have been unlikely to have survived in that environment, a peat soil, for all that time. The soil was pretty acidic, and it would have almost certainly have destroyed the shell. The second was that it was part of a collection that supposedly had been found together, but all the items together didn't make sense. The third was that the shell was probably an ancient one, and it was probably from the Ohio River area and the tribe that I mentioned earlier. However, Hilburn Crescent had a reputation of stealing artifacts from archaeological sites, and he'd actually gotten fired from a worldwide exposition for doing exactly that. And it's also problematic that the depiction on the shell was suspiciously very close to the way that the drawing had looked from the one in France. In addition, people that know these things can take a look at the drawing and say it looks more like an elephant than it would a what we would think that a mammoth would look like. Finally, though, in the late 1980s, they carbon dated the shell, this artifact, and found that the shell dates to about 885 AD, which pretty much puts a nail in the coffin of it being an earlier artifact. There is a similar story to another forgery, the Lenape stone, which was found in nearby Pennsylvania, which was also appended and also happened to have a mammoth drawing on it. We're going to move up a little bit now and talk about some of the explorers. And it's interesting to me to first think or read about what the country looked like at this time. This is like very early 1600s, and this is from one of the earliest descriptions of the area from a man that we'll hear about a little bit later called Cornelius Hendrickson. And the first thing that jumps out at me was the description of the wildlife that was in the area. Large predators like panthers and wildcats and wolves were common, along with some other animals that for the most part went extinct during or after the colonial era and would be considered extinct or rare for much of our modern history. It wasn't until the 20th century that we saw some of these animals make a comeback, sometimes perhaps a little too close for comfort. If you remember the Delaware story from last year where a black bear was wandering around Newcastle County, and you may have missed it, but it was apparently spotted last week up north as well. May have been the same bear or may not, but bears have not been common in Delaware for a long time. And as a personal note, I work up in Newcastle County off at 273, and there's an active beaver colony there, and you can open. I go on when I go to work, you get to see the works of the beavers in the wooded areas around where I work. And although the wildlife stands out because that kind of jumps out at you, I think the biggest difference, though, we would see would be in the flora of the area. Delaware was full of old growth forest, except some near the coast and occasional clearings in the interior. The Native Americans would burn this area for farming and to help in hunting in the fall. But it was extremely limited, and most of the state was still very densely forested. And part of it was due to the limited population, but another may have been the size of the trees. Now, today they publish books of the large trees of Delaware, and to be a huge tree in Delaware today, depending on the variety, it'd have to be about 100 foot high, depending on the variety. The largest white oak today, for example, would be up in I think it's reported to be up in Baltimore Creek State Park, and it's about 103 feet high. Old growth trees of this earlier era, when people first started visiting the area, would have been much taller and much broader. They would have been much slower growing, and the wood would have been tighter, and the trees would have been more dense. And the trees could top over 200 feet in height, which means The trees literally would be twice as tall as the tallest ones we have now. Now, most of that old growth forest was gone by about 1850, with the last pocket of the original forest, as far as I can tell, was in west of Seaford, from looking at the old forestry maps, and that went under the axe about in the 1920s. This wood fueled many things. It fueled the industrial age. It fueled our shipbuilding, as well as houses. It went for houses as well and lumber and fuel. And I think we also have to realize that there are many areas in our current area that we go to look at the old growth today, or we look at wooded areas and we think that they're really old. But a good example would be there's a Fork Branch Nature Preserve off of Kenton Road, which has trees that are in the 70 to 100 years age group. But that's certainly a far cry from the 300 to 400-year-old trees we would have seen in the 1600s. Another major difference, and maybe even more obvious to those of us who live in the area, in the coastal Delaware area, would be our marshes. They would have looked way different back then. I mean, of course, during the colonial era, we did some dredging and straightening and draining of the marshes and rivers. But the biggest change, I believe, would have been the Phragmites. The Phragmites are those marsh plants with the feathery tops that we see all over the area. And I've lived within walking distance of Phragmites in my entire life, and it is hard to fathom a landscape without them. However, this species came over fairly late in the 1800s, but unfortunately, it quickly displaced the native marsh plants like cattails, rice, and orchards, with the roots toxic to other plant life and choking it out. Well, the Europeans really began to get interested in the area in the 1600s, or more accurately, ways to get around are through the continent to get a shortcut to the spice trade in Asia. Henry Hudson was one of these explorers and is credited with being the first European to discover the Delaware Bay in 1609. Now, this may have been at the peak of Henry Hudson's life. He, of course, like many of the explorers at the time, were happy claiming land for various kings. He was an English explorer, but he was exploring for the Dutch. But what they were really looking for was a passage to Asia. He got to what would be modern Cape Henlopen, but he didn't go further because the water was too shallow and he didn't have a boat to do the soundings in front of him, which was also his clue that with the shallow water, that this was probably not the passage to Asia. So he continued up the coast looking for the Northwest Passage. Later that year, he would discover the Hudson River and was the first to lay claim to the area, including the island of Manhattan, on behalf of the Netherlands, who would rule the area until 1667. Again, as I said, Henry was an Englishman, and when he got back to England, his country wasn't really thrilled that he was doing all this, that he had claimed all this territory for a foreign country. So they forbade him from ever being the captain of a foreign ship. Well, in 1610, he headed back on an English ship, the Discovery, to the New World, also under the contract of a merchant. That voyage didn't work quite as well for Henry. He was known as, and as maybe as most explorers would have to be, he would have to have been a very determined person. Maybe a bit too determined for the crew. They spent the winter in Hudson Bay in Canada aboard their ship, which doesn't sound like a very pleasant experience. And in that, in the June of that year, they refused to continue, and they decided to sail back to England without Henry. So in June 1611, they seized him. They set him in a small lifeboat with his son and 7 men who had scurvy, and cast them adrift into the wilderness. Now, there's also some possibility that it wasn't so benign, that there's some research that indicates maybe they actually simply flat out murdered him. But for the most part, the point was Henry didn't make it back to England. And so that while he was on this voyage that would meet his untimely end, while he was on this voyage, we had our second European visitor. And quite often, I think the second person gets the short end of the stick, but maybe not in this case. Maybe we may have the wrong slide, but on August 17, 1610, Samuel Argall, an English captain, was on his way from Virginia to Bermuda and got blown slightly off his course. He entered this unknown bay to ride out the storm by ducking behind modern Cape Henlopen. He named the land and the river behind it for the governor of Virginia, Thomas West, also known as Lord Delaware. But he also had several additional claims to fame. The first was his first mission, which was to discover a new route that would cut the sailing time to the New World to only 10 weeks, which was a bit more reliable and would require a lot less provisions on the trip. And his second was in his diplomatic work with the Powhatan Confederacy in the Jamestown area. Now, I use the term diplomatic a bit loosely. He abducted the chief's daughter, Pocahontas, perhaps you've heard of her, and held her for ransom in exchange for the return of some captives and property. She was treated as royalty, and this 17th century of diplomacy did work, and peace was eventually restored. Okay, skip one more slide, honey. Thank you. I must have gotten off. Okay, our final explorer that I think gets the short end of the stick I'm going to mention is Cornelius Hendrickson, another Dutch explorer. He came up the Delaware River on the ship the Restless, which was significant in that it is one of the first ships that the Dutch built in the New World for exploration. So he certainly traveled in the area. In 1616, he rescued 3 Europeans that were on Delaware soil, and they are probably the first unnamed occupants of the soil. And the description that we started with the beaver and all the animals comes from his description. It's also described, Delaware is also described elsewhere by the Dutch as wonderfully flat, which if you think about where they come from, the Netherlands, it's very much of a compliment. Now, Cornelius skipped over much of Delaware, though, and continued up the river on his explorations, which took him all the way up to Trenton. He's credited with being the first European to set foot in Pennsylvania, as well as the western side of New Jersey. I would also notice, if you look at this map, that there is a Cape Cornelius there, and the name was in dispute. Obviously, it depends on who discovered it and which map you were using. But instead of choosing this Dutchman's name, they eventually went with the Swedish name, which means entering in, or Henlopen. Now, in the mid-1600s, there wasn't as much development in this area for a couple of reasons. One was that to the north, we had the Dutch on an island off the river, Fort Casimir, and later New Amstel, and then Newcastle, and this with Swedes in Wilmington at Fort Christiana. And to the south, we had the Dutch in Lewis, both of which were considered much more desirable in our area. and this area was pretty much ignored by the Dutch. Any Europeans in the area would have been trappers and hunters and squatters. When development would happen, the type of settlement when the development would eventually happen, the type of development, the settlements that we would get would differ between our northern and southern neighbors, where those developments tended to be settled in towns and were settled by immigrants from Europe. Our area was exclusively farms and plantations, and the areas were settled primarily people coming from surrounding states, not from Europe. I think it's worth noting that the Dutch, who conquered the Swedish in 1655, had established an administrative district for what we might consider the proto-Kent County. While they tended to stick to the Newcastle area, they also had an administrative district that extended from about Bombay Hook all the way down to the Horkill or Lewis. Any settlers in this area that we know tended to settle down by Lewis, once again bypassing our area. In 1664, the next major chapter of our life began with the takeover of the area by the English, or more specifically, the areas that mattered at the time of Lewis and Newcastle. This particular Anglo-Dutch War was settled in 1667, with the result being that the Dutch kept some of the South American holdings that they had, and in effect ceding the lands of New Netherlands, which included Delaware. And this began the slow Anglicization of the area that we now know as Delaware, and the beginning of the English structure and institutions. By this time, settlers in Newcastle and Lewis, as well as nearby Maryland, were exploring modern-day Kent County as they hunted and trapped, but they started becoming aware of the rich soil and started being interested in grants for the land. With the Anglo-Dutch War settled, the area fell to the control of the king's brother, James, Duke of York. In addition to establishing the English institutions, he did a couple other things that helped. He allowed for the existing settlers, mostly Dutch, to keep their lands. He also, for a short time, allowed the Dutch officials and judges to remain in office under the control of an English military commander, and he started the transition to English laws and judiciary traditions. And he also established two courts, one in Newcastle that extended down to Bombay Hook, and another court in Lewis, who had jurisdiction from Bombay Hook down to Fenwick Island. Now, settlements were not a priority at this time. They tended to focus on the settled areas they had already acquired by consolidating control and improving the defenses, especially in light of competing claims to the land, which were more of a priority. In addition, the Anglo-Dutch War didn't help, with the Dutch briefly recapturing New York and all the land it controlled. In addition, we had previously described the Lenni Lenape as being a peaceful people, and I think they were, but they were growing restless at this time. And there's a report to the governor at this time which states the chiefs, the Native American chiefs, the chiefs give the reason for their war that they threatened to make upon the Christians is that they say where the English come, they drive them from their land. For instance, to North Virginia and Maryland, and fear if it is not timely prevented, they shall do here. I think they were onto something there. The Duke of York appointed Francis Lovelace, the second governor of New York in 1688, which included the area that we live in today. Now, Lovelace's story and his background is also interesting, with many ups and downs. He was a fierce loyalist during the English Civil War, and Colonel Lovelace commanded forces in Wales. Unfortunately, he was forced to surrender, and then he fled to France. 15 years later, he came back to help the Royalist uprising, but was arrested by Oliver Cromwell's forces, charged with treason, and sent to the Tower of London. That, unfortunately, is not usually a career-enhancing move. Those of you that have been there, they have Traitor's Gate, which is like, you can go in, but you don't come out. In this case, though, Lovelace got a little lucky. He happened to have gotten captured. Again, he's coming back to help restore the monarchy. He gets captured, and then it happens right before Cromwell was overthrown. And Charles II was restored to the throne, and Francis Lovelace is released and rewarded for his loyal service. As the Duke of York, and he also had a friendship with the Duke of York, Charles's brother, and so he eventually would get his loyalty rewarded with the governorship of New York. Next slide. Yeah. Now, Governor Lovelace made the first grant of land in the area to Thomas Young near the St. Jones, near the St. Jones Creek on the Delaware Bay, with Thomas Merritt given a similar tract of land also on the St. Jones on that day, with others to follow close by. Now, the reason for these grants in this same area is apparent. The land is high and dry, it's near the bay, and it's along the streams that are deep enough to navigate when there were no roads and treacherous terrain, which made travel along the St. Jones the obvious choice. Now, land near there was still old growth forests, and the clearing of land was difficult. And almost all these early settlers were farmers who worked their own land with their farmers, with their families, or they are with single freemen who were working with friends until they were ready to work their own land. At this time period, there were very few indentured servants, slaves, or skilled tradesmen in this area. Working on the land was rough. The forests were old growth and full of large trees, and the clearing of land was very difficult. And after clearing the land, they would generally plant corn, wheat, rye, and tobacco. Now, these grants were almost always along the various waterways. The intent was to encourage settlement in the area, and to help that, the terms were pretty generous. The only cost for the land rent was 1 bushel of winter wheat per 100 acres. And the tracts ranged in size from 400 to 1,000 acres and had fanciful names like Simpson's Choice, Orphan's Lot, and Kingston upon Hull. And in that first month, 13 patents, about a total of about 5,300 acres or about 8 square miles, were issued. However, after that initial burst of activity, development didn't exactly flourish in the area. There would be no additional patents issued until 1675, and of the original 13 patents, only a few were actually occupied, with a large majority of them being sold or simply abandoned by the first owners. In 1675, with the English back in control of the area from the Dutch, having taken over Manhattan, and then English by treaty getting the area back, the land grants continued, again, primarily from the same areas as before. Growth in the area was still fairly low, with before 1680, no year had more than 20 grants in a year. Now, I mentioned Governor Lovelace earlier, and some of these points I've already mentioned, and he didn't have as a fanciful life as the names of Kingston upon Hull or Orphan's Lot. As I indicated earlier, the one Anglo-Dutch war had ended, but it would not be the last. The third one broke out in 1672, and in 1673, the Dutch attacked Fort James, which is on the island of Manhattan, while Governor Lovelace was in Connecticut meeting with the governor. He was meeting with the governor to establish what would be the first postal system between New York and Boston in the New World. So he left his deputy in charge, and who wound up surrendering the fort, ceding control of the North American territories back to the Dutch. This is also not a career-enhancing move. And upon his return to England, Lovelace was arrested and sent once again to the Tower of London, more or less on charges of dereliction of duty. While in the Tower of London, he fell seriously ill, but was released and died shortly afterwards. Now, as we talk about the 1680s and moving forward, you start realizing that there are some areas that you could do a whole presentation on in and of itself. And I think I'll talk a little bit about William Penn and some of his issues, but there's a lot to unpack on William Penn, and you could certainly do your whole presentation on him as well. Now, 1683, Kent County is officially formed, but the push for local control had started earlier than that. Now, what drives most of that is that when you need to go to court, which handled most of the legal and administrative work, you might go to various government agencies today. In 1680, if you had to go to court, you got to travel down to Lewis. And their complaint at the time for the residents in the area was that this 50 to 60 mile journey was through hazardous and dangerous area with unmarked marshes and swamps and rivers that couldn't be crossed, and that there was no accommodations on this whole way down to Lewis. Certainly is a lot different than it is today. Now, the move to get the county formed was led by Captain John Briggs, who owned Kingston upon Hull and co-owned another plantation called Town Point, which were the first two farms along the north side of the St. Jones. And Francis Whitwell, who called his land Whitwell's Delight, and he was on the south side of the St. Jones. So obviously prime land, they're probably doing really well, and they led the petition to the governor of New York. Now, this petition is signed by 65 men who represented 65 of the 100 families that they claim lived in the area. And the reason why they say they didn't get the other 35 is that the boats, and they write this down, the ship is leaving, we want to get this on the ship, and we don't have time to go get the other signatures. And so they asked for a new county to be formed. They requested it be from the north side of Cedar Creek, which is below Milford, to the south side of Blackbird Creek up near Town's End. Now, the new governor, Edmund Andros, grants the petition, and the county is chartered by the Duke of York. But he fixes the boundaries at Duck Creek in Smyrna and Cedar Creek to the south near Milford, and is named St. John's County, probably named after a parish in Kent County, England. Shortly afterwards, the first court for the new county was held in 1680. The exact date or location isn't known. It's possible that it was held at the home of Chief Justice Whitwell's home across the creek from Kingston upon Hull near the mouth of the St. Jones. The early court dealt with pretty much everything you would go to a levy court today for. They dealt with land grants, the laying out of roads and bridge building, we don't have servant indentures today, as well as those charged with breaking the law. They also found that year in 1680 to license the area's first tavern, certainly a noteworthy event. However, not everyone is exactly happy about with the new local court. At the second session that summer, a local man was found guilty of slander of the justice of the peace. Apparently, he questioned how the Duke of York could be such a fool to make such inconsiderate sons of whores to be justices. That was not particularly well taken by the court. He wound up paying 500 pounds of tobacco, the court costs, and was bound over, which is the equivalent of probation, for 1 year. Now, in 1682, William Penn enters the picture. As most of us know, as a Quaker, he was somewhat troublesome in England, who were busy enough dealing with issues between the Catholics and Protestants. Now, in this environment, Penn stood out. And I think we kind of know that Penn was a Quaker and he was kind of I think we think of him as an instigator, but I don't think a lot of times we realize what an instigator he was. He would write 42 books and pamphlets in 7 years after he became a Quaker. And he attacked, in turn, the basic beliefs of Roman Catholics, Anglicans, and even other dissenting churches. So he wrote against everybody. And this was a bit of an embarrassment for the William Penn family, who were of the gentry class. But eventually, the senior William Penn grew to accept his son's new religion. Now, Penn's father, also named William, was close enough to the royal family that it was he who had gone to Holland to bring back Charles II from exile, and after which he was knighted. The senior Penn would go on to get a lot of titles, and winding up as Admiral and Commissioner of the English Navy. However, while he got titles and knighthoods, he didn't necessarily get a lot of money, which I think may have been part of the fact that the monarchy has just been restored and cash is a little tight. So in 1682, after 10 years of being a very vocal missionary for Quakerism, Penn, he requests a land grant in exchange for a very large debt the crown owed his now deceased father, which Penn names after his father, Pennsylvania. Now, there's a fair amount of negotiation that's going on during this time. It meant that it also means for the first time by the administrative process, the 3 lower counties on the Delaware are a separate and distinct identity. Before this, they had been part of New Sweden, New Netherland, and New York. In addition, it is in a bit of legal jeopardy, as the Duke of York had failed to include it in some of his earlier patents, and Lord Baltimore of Maryland claimed everything south of the Schuylkill River. And of course, that would not get decided until 1767 with the drawing of the Mason-Dixon line. Penn also realizes that his Pennsylvania colony could be cut off from the sea, and he wanted to own at least one side of the Delaware River. So a few months later, he acquires the 3 lower counties and changes the name to Kent County. Technically, William Penn's holdings consist of 2 grants. There was the Newcastle grant with the 12-mile radius that we know about, which he paid 10 shillings up front and 5 shillings a year in rent. And for the second parcel of land, which was that land 12 miles below Newcastle down to Cape Henlopen. And for that, he paid, I think was kind of interesting, he paid 10 shillings, half the profits from the area, and a rose every year at the Feast of St. Michael to the Duke of York. Now, that legal claim of Maryland to the territory, as we know, would come up in disputes with Maryland in the future. But for now, Delaware as a separate entity is now part of Penn's domain. Now, eventually, William Penn forms a General Assembly for his colony with 2 of the 7 men that we mentioned earlier, Francis Whitwell and John Briggs, as part of that General Assembly. They also vote on December 7th, 1682, an act of union which formally attaches Penn's two new grants to the province of Pennsylvania. At the time, they thought it was a good thing. He was a very active leader. Penn was a very active leader, and he spent that year issuing various appointments, proclamations, and orders, including the renaming of St. John's County to Kent County on December 25th, 1682. Now, shortly afterwards, in 1683, realizing that of the 3 counties that he has in the Delaware, the new Kent County did not have a central government area. He orders the town of Dover to be built. He laid out the width of the main and side streets. He designated the sides of the lots, which are 1.5 acres, and even sent the ground rent. 1 bushel of winter wheat are 4 shillings annually to the residents of this new town. However, it would not get built for many years afterwards, and not all was great between the new government and the 3 lower counties. The first was that Maryland continued to assert its claims on the land, especially the southern and western areas. Lord Baltimore continued to encourage settlement of the land from his people, but he also collected taxes and tithes at Pistol Point, tried to file suits, and even threw people in prison and took their land. The second issue was pirates. For a while, pirates like Blackbeard, Avery, and Kidd would terrorize the area, seizing shipping and raiding inhabitants near the shores. In addition, there was the rumors that the governors and lieutenant governors that were appointed were in cahoots with the pirates. But eventually, between the ships of the former Duke of York, now King James II, that were sent to defend the coast, and William Penn's efforts, pirates were mostly cleared from the Delaware River and bays around 1700. And encouraged by a very low tax rate from William Penn, settlements continued, and the values of the property continue to increase. The only problem with the low tax rates is that they were so low that, and the resentment against the Penn government, that the rates were almost too low to bother to collect by the taxpayers. And of course, it is during this time that more of the founding families of the area start to move in, attracted by the rich soil and the greater religious freedom and increased legal presence. Many of the names that historians and genealogists note would be active in the area for the next 4 centuries arrive. Names like Barrett and Berry, Bishop, Clark, Chew, Emerson, Hall, Hudson, Hunn, Jackson, Jones, Luff, Parody, Richardson, Webb, and Wilson would all arrive in the area before the 1700s. In fact, by 1693, Kent County had 18 people who were worth more than 200 pounds, with the richest person in Kent County being worth over 1,000 pounds. Now, by comparison, Newcastle County had 20 people that were more than 200 pounds, and Philadelphia County had 43. I would also note that this is also the year that the first courthouse is built in Dover, what would be Dover. And a broader comparison as a check of the relative wealth is how much was raised by a tax in 1693 that charged a penny per each pound of wealth. And Penn collected a little over 88 pounds from Kent, 101 from Sussex, and 143 pounds from Newcastle County, and 315 from Philadelphia County. But even as the area grew, though, the discontent continued to rise. Part of it was Penn's falling out of power and his lack of authority. With William and Mary ascending to the throne, his political life was somewhat derailed, since friends of the former monarch were seen as being very suspicious to the new ones. And he lost government control of the colonies, though not the soil grants, with Pennsylvania being placed under the control of the royal governor of New York. However, even with his power diminished, he still was able to appoint he was able to get separate deputy governors appointed, and he was able to retain some level of control for the 3 lower counties, which he would eventually regain briefly. And he would remain in that position. So he appointed William Markham, and who would remain in that position until William Penn regained control of his colonies in 1699. Penn's troubles did not abate during that time. He continued to have troubles with the crown regarding controls of the colonies, and there was definitely a move afoot to convert all private colonies to royal colonies. But he also had trouble with the colonies themselves. The 3 lower counties really weren't happy with the union with Pennsylvania, and they took advantage of some of Penn's troubles to push through legislation that led to, in effect, the separate general assemblies for the 3 lower counties and one for Pennsylvania. An interesting aspect of that was that the way that they did that was that the three lower counties General Assembly, when they would pass a law, well, when Pennsylvania colony passed a law, they had to go to get approval by the Duke of York. Basically had to be approved by the governor, then the Duke of York. The three lower counties, because of the way that they did it, they did not have to get approval of their laws by the Duke of York, only the governor of Pennsylvania. So Penn's fighting for control of his colonies, and he heads back to England, knowing that he may lose them, and he really wasn't in much of a position to fight. However, his ability to get appointments of the deputy governors was able to forestall the separation. However, it wasn't to be permanent. Eventually, a compromise was reached, and Delaware formed its own General Assembly in 1704 with William Rodney of Kent County, the grandfather of Caesar Rodney, who we believe was head of the assembly. And that's kind of interesting because Caesar Rodney, of course, would be the head of the last General Assembly under the king. But another problem that the English were having were the French, as they tend to have had throughout their history, who attacked Louis in 1709. Finding unguarded, they simply walked through the streets and took what they could, holding people for hostage for additional food. They would try a couple months later to come back, but this time the governor was there with the militia and was able to fight them off. William Penn continued to have trouble with the colonies and his governors and the crown, and as he was getting old, and he began to negotiate the sale of his government rights, although not his land rights, to the crown. Unfortunately, Penn would have a major stroke, and the sale would not be resolved until many, many years later. So with the General Assembly laying out the plans by the General Assembly laying out the plan by a special commission of Delaware General Assembly in 1717, finally laying out the plans of William Penn from 34 years in the past, although they did lay it out somewhat differently than William Penn had specified. Of course, there was some settlement in the area, but it was still growing fairly slow. And also realizing that there was some people in the area, enough to request ministers from the Anglican Church and the Presbyterian Church. They would request ministers, and they would rotate between Dover, Duck Creek, and Mispillion. The area grew slowly. Penn probably hoped for some additional growth in the area, but it continued to grow somewhat slow in that general area. And we also see some more of the founding families begin to assert themselves in the area. The Dickinsons, who had held land in the area for a while, they continued to grow their holdings, which included 800 acres purchased in 1676. They still were a few years from arriving, but the family was consolidating their holdings around what we know, of course, as the Dickinson plantation, which was considered the best land in the county. I hope this look back in time at the land and the people that made the area where we make our homes have been enjoyable to you. It's something I have been trying to do for a number of years, and having the Friends of Dover put it on the calendar forced me to buckle down and do this labor of love. So at this, I thank you very much for the time, and I'll turn it back to Mary, or if there's any questions. I saw there was one question from Jack.
Mary, you're on mute.
I know. I'm sorry about that. Thank you, Ellen.
You're welcome. What was the question?
Oh, there's one question from Jack about the American chestnut in the early contact period. I know that there was a lot of chestnut around, and that was probably, I know that there were still chestnuts in the area, or the sprigs of chestnuts growing up. Even in my youth, there were still some chestnuts that had been, obviously the chestnut had gotten the blight, they were chopped down, but sprigs would continue to grow up. They would get a certain height and they would chop down. I don't know that they were real. I don't think they were real common. They were available, but it was more of the other trees that they mentioned. Any other questions?
The reason I asked was that in many areas, the American chestnut was the most numerous tree in the forest. And when the blight broke out in the very early 20th century, my father's first job, while he was going to, in summers when he was going to school at Millersville, was actually surveying the spread of the blight in central and western Pennsylvania. It's well, the chestnut was an extremely useful wood, and you still get fine old pieces of furniture made of chestnut.
Oh, yeah, it was probably, that certainly would have been a major change into because the chestnuts were even larger than the oak trees. Any other questions?
Yes, I think you made a very interesting presentation. Really enjoyed it. Just 2 points you had not mentioned. I probably don't have time to get into it now, but I'm curious about the Nanticokes, who were an offshoot of the Linnaeus, and also the more fascinating Moors, which were around Cheswold, south of Dover. So I'm just curious what you may have discovered, or whether that might be a future presentation.
I'll be honest. The Moors, I think, certainly are an interesting